The thing in the snow was small. It was a patch of wrongness in a world of white, a smudge of dark blue against the endless, howling canvas of the blizzard. At first, he thought it was a raven, fallen from the sky, its feathers frozen stiff. Or maybe a piece of canvas torn from a passing wagon, though no wagons had any business on this forsaken mountain pass, not in the heart of a winter this cruel. This is how a world ends. Not with a roar of thunder, but with a whimper lost in the wind. A small sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent cold. And it is also how another world, against all reason and against all odds, begins. He almost walked past it. His business was with his trap lines, a grim and lonely communion with steel and blood and the small, desperate struggles of animals. He was a man of routine, and this blue smudge was not part of it. His eyes, narrowed against the stinging wind, registered it and dismissed it. Keep moving. The cold bites deep when you stand still. Home was a 2-mile tramp through the drifts, and the fire in his hearth was dying. But something made him stop. A flicker of movement? A trick of the wind-whipped snow? He turned his head, the fur of his parka hood scratching against his stubbled cheek. He squinted. It was not a bird. It was not canvas. It was a child. A child. The word was alien in his mind, a relic from a language he no longer spoke. He moved closer, his snowshoes crunching with a sound that seemed obscenely loud in the storm's embrace. He saw a small boot, worn and thin, peeking out from the snowdrift. A tiny hand, fingers curled into a fist, the knuckles a terrifying shade of blue. A tangle of dark hair, matted with ice. The child was lying face down a small still mound that was slowly, surely being buried by the storm. He felt nothing at first, a dull, distant surprise. Then a familiar bitterness rose in his throat. Foolish. Whatever fool parent had brought a child up here deserved this. The mountain did not care for foolishness. It was a place of hard truths and harder consequences. He should turn around, walk away. This was not his concern. It was a ghost, another ghost in a life already crowded with them. He had no room for more. He took a step back toward his own trail. Then he saw it. The small body shivered. A tremor, violent and spastic, that ran through the tiny frame and then was still again. It was not a ghost, not yet. It was a life, flickering like a candle flame in a gale. A curse, low and guttural, escaped his lips. It was torn away by the wind. He had spent 10 years building walls around his heart, stone by heavy stone. He had perfected the art of feeling nothing. He had made a covenant with loneliness, and it had kept its side of the bargain. He was empty. He was safe. But you cannot unsee a child shivering in the snow. You cannot unknow that a life is guttering out just feet from where you stand. The walls inside him, so carefully built, trembled. A single stone shifted. He lunged forward, dropping to his knees in the deep powder. He put his gloved hands on the small shape and turned it over. It was a girl. Her face was waxen, her lips the color of a bruise. Her eyes were closed, lashes feathered with ice. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. So small, so terribly small. She wore a thin wool coat, the kind a town child might wear for an autumn evening, not for the teeth of a mountain winter. She was clutching a small oilskin satchel to her chest, her frozen fingers locked around it like a vice. He had a choice, a simple one. Leave her to the mountain, which was the same as killing her himself, or bring this complication, this vessel of pain and memory, into his sanctuary, into the quiet, gray world he had built from the ashes of another life. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind, that if he touched her, if he took her in, nothing would ever be the same. The quiet would be broken. The gray would be stained. The ghosts would stir. He hesitated for a full minute, the storm screaming around him, a battle raging in the hollow space where his soul used to be. Then the girl made a sound, a tiny, broken whimper. It was the sound of a wounded animal. It was the sound of his own daughter, Sarah, in her last fevered sleep. The battle was over. The walls crumbled. He scooped her up. Now, before we go one step further into that cabin, before the fire is stoked and the story truly begins, I need to speak to you directly. We are a community built on stories like this one, stories of hope found in darkness, of strength discovered in broken places. If these are the kinds of stories you want to see more of, the kind that remind you of the light that can exist even in the coldest of winters, then please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. And in the comments below, tell us what city or country you're watching from. It is a wondrous thing to see how far these stories travel, connecting us all, from a snowy mountain pass to a warm room across the world. Your presence here makes this possible, and for that, I am truly grateful. All right, let's step back into that biting wind, where a man who had forgotten how to care is now carrying the world in his arms. She weighed nothing. It was the first thing he noticed. He had expected some heft, the solid weight of a living child, but she felt like a bundle of dry sticks wrapped in cloth, a bird with broken wings, a shadow. The thought was a spike of ice in his gut. How long had she been out here? How long since she'd last eaten a proper meal? He tucked her against his chest, trying to shield her small frame from the wind with his own body. He pulled his parka around her as best he could and began the long walk home. The journey back was different. Before, it had been a simple mechanical act of putting one foot in front of the other. Now, it was a pilgrimage. Every step was measured, careful. He was acutely aware of the precious, fragile burden he carried. He could feel the faint, shallow puffs of her breath against his neck. In, out. A tiny, faltering rhythm. It was the most important sound in the world. His cabin was little more than a one-room box of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss. It was a fortress against the world, and against his own memory. Smoke curled weakly from its stone chimney, a gray banner of survival. He kicked the door open with his boot, not bothering to fumble with the latch. The wind howled in behind him, a hungry predator. He slammed the door shut, plunging the room into dim, firelit shadow. The sudden silence was a blessing. The air inside was cool, the fire in the hearth having burned down to sullen orange coals. He didn't lay the girl in his own cot. It was too far from the heat. Instead, he gently placed her on the bearskin rug directly in front of the fireplace, her small head resting on a rolled-up blanket he pulled from the bed. Her body was limp, pliant. She did not stir. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing heavily, snow melting from his beard and dripping onto the wooden floor. He looked down at her, this impossible thing that had washed up on the shore of his solitude. What now? He was a man who knew how to set a trap, skin a buck, and read a winter sky. He was not a man who knew how to care for a child. The knowledge had been his once, but he had buried it deep, along with a small, handmade wooden horse and a tiny pair of worn leather shoes. Panic, a cold and unfamiliar sensation, pricked at him. He forced it down. First things first. Warmth. He turned to the hearth, his movements urgent. He threw on kindling, then larger pieces of split pine. He worked the bellows until the coals glowed fiercely and flames licked up, catching the dry wood with a hungry crackle. The fire roared to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls, pushing the encroaching cold back into the corners of the room. He turned back to the girl. He needed to get her out of the wet clothes. His hands, rough and calloused from years of hard labor, felt huge and clumsy as he fumbled with the buttons of her thin coat. He worked slowly, carefully, afraid he might break her. He peeled the damp wool away. Underneath, she wore a simple threadbare dress. It, too, was damp. He hesitated, a sense of propriety warring with the urgent need for action. The need won. He gently worked the dress over her head, leaving her in a thin cotton shift. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and marred with bruises. Old ones, yellow and faded. New ones, stark and purple against the white of her skin. A long, ugly scratch ran down one arm. His breath caught in his throat. This was not just the mountain's cruelty. This was the cruelty of a man. The sight of it lit a slow, cold fire in his belly. He pulled his thickest wool blanket from his cot and wrapped her in it, swaddling her like an infant. He tucked it tightly around her small body, leaving only her face exposed. He knelt beside her and looked closer. Her face was smudged with dirt, and a line of dried blood traced from a cut on her lip. He saw the telltale white patches of frostbite on the tips of her fingers and the lobes of her ears. He cursed again, a prayer of helpless anger. He went to the water bucket, chipped away the layer of ice on top, and poured some into a small pot, which he hung over the fire. While it warmed, he tore a strip from a clean linen shirt, one he hadn't worn in years. When the water was warm to the touch, he dipped the cloth in it and returned to her side. He hesitated for a second, then gently, so gently, began to clean her face. He wiped away the grime, the tear tracks, the smear of blood. His touch was tentative, unpracticed. It had been 10 years since he had touched another human being with tenderness. The memory of it, the ghost of a feeling, was a painful ache in his chest. He remembered washing his own daughter's face when she was sick, the feel of her small cheek, hot with fever, under his hand. The memory was a knife twisting. He flinched, his hand jerking back. No, do not go there. That door was closed, locked, and the key thrown away. He forced himself to focus on the task. The girl in front of him. The real, living child on his floor. He finished cleaning her face, then gently dabbed at the frost-bitten skin on her hands and ears with the warm cloth. There was little more he could do. Only warmth and time and whatever luck the universe had left to spare. He sat back on his heels, watching her. The firelight played across her still features. In the warmth of the cabin, some of the awful blueness was receding from her lips, replaced by a pale, fragile pink. Her breathing was still shallow, but it was steady. A tiny flag of life planted in defiance of the storm. He pulled a three-legged stool closer to the fire, sat down, and began his vigil. He did not know what he was waiting for her to wake up, or for her not to. He just knew he could not leave her side. He sat and listened to the two sounds that now filled his world, the crackle of the fire and the impossibly small sound of a child's breath. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, a symphony of shrieking wind and rattling shutters. Inside, the only movement was the flicker of the flames and the slow rise and fall of the blanket over the girl's chest. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He just watched. He was a sentinel at a post he hadn't known he was meant to guard. It happened just as the first pale gray light of dawn began to filter through the cabin's single window. Her eyelids fluttered. Then they opened. Her eyes were a deep, dark brown, and they were filled with a terror so profound it made him physically recoil. She didn't scream. The sound she made was worse. A strangled gasp, a frantic intake of breath. She scrambled backward, crab-walking away from him, dragging the heavy blanket with her until her back hit the rough logs of the wall. She huddled there, a small, terrified animal cornered in its den. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on him. On his size, his beard, his rough clothes. On the threat he represented. His first instinct was to move toward her, to comfort her, to say something reassuring. But he saw the way she flinched, the way her small body tensed as if expecting a blow. He stopped himself. He understood. In her world, a man like him was not a rescuer. He was the danger. So he did the opposite. He made himself smaller. He slowly slid off the stool and sat on the hard planked floor, drawing his knees up to his chest. He held his hands out, palms up and empty, and kept them perfectly still in his lap. He did not try to smile. He knew his face, etched with grief and solitude, was not a comforting sight. He just sat. He waited. He let the silence stretch, broken only by her ragged, fearful breathing. "Easy now," he said, and was shocked by the sound of his own voice. It was a rasp, a croak. The words felt foreign on his tongue. He cleared his throat and tried again, pitching his voice lower, softer. "Easy. You're safe here." The words meant nothing to her. They were just sounds made by the monster in the corner. She continued to stare, her small chest heaving. He could see the frantic beat of a pulse in her thin neck. He knew that words were useless. He needed a different language, the oldest one. He thought about the stew he had simmering on the hearth, a thin broth of salted venison and wild onions. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He reached for the pot, moving with excruciating slowness, never taking his eyes off her, telegraphing his every move. He ladled a small amount of the broth into a wooden bowl. The smell, savory and warm, filled the small cabin. It was his own meal. His only meal for the day. The thought came and went without any weight. It simply did not matter. He placed the bowl on the floorboard between them. Then, using his fingertips, he slid it slowly across the floor until it was just a few feet from where she was huddled. He did not push it all the way. He left a space. The choice had to be hers. He retreated, moving back to his spot and turning his gaze away from her, toward the fire. He gave her the privacy of his inattention. He acted as if he were absorbed in watching the flames, though every nerve ending he possessed was screamingly aware of the small, terrified creature behind him. He heard nothing. The silence stretched. Maybe she was too scared. Maybe she was too sick. Then he heard a sound. The scrape of the wooden bowl against the floor. He did not turn. He remained perfectly still. He heard a soft, hesitant sip, then another. Then a series of desperate, gulping sounds, the sounds of a creature starved past all caution. He heard a wet, choked sob, and then another. She was crying as she ate, great, shuddering sobs of pain and relief, and a grief too large for her small body to contain. The sound of her weeping broke the last of the ice around his heart. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, and the pain of it, the thawing, was so intense it made him gasp. He closed his eyes. He did not turn around. He just sat, listening to her cry, and felt 10 years of frozen grief begin to melt inside him. When the sobs finally subsided, replaced by the quiet, rhythmic sound of sipping, he risked a glance over his shoulder. She had drained the bowl. She was holding it in her lap with both hands, as if afraid someone would snatch it away. Her face was streaked with tears and broth. She was still watching him, but the raw terror in her eyes had been replaced by something else, a deep, bottomless weariness and a flicker of, what, confusion? Curiosity? It was a start. He waited a long time before he spoke again. He let her get used to his presence, to the warmth of the fire, to the feeling of food in her belly. When he finally did speak, his voice was even softer than before. "You got a name, little one?" She flinched at the sound, but she didn't retreat. She stared at him, her small brow furrowed. She seemed to be weighing the question, deciding if a name was a safe thing to give away. Finally, a tiny, whispered word breached her lips. "Lily!" The name was like a flower, so fragile and out of place in this harsh, gray world. "Lily," he repeated, testing the shape of it. "That's a fine name." He paused. "My name is Elias." She said nothing. She just watched him with those old eyes. He didn't push. He knew this would be a slow and delicate process, like taming a wild thing. He just sat with her, sharing the silence until the exhaustion finally claimed her and her head drooped, her eyes fluttering closed. She fell asleep right there, sitting up against the wall, the empty bowl still clutched in her lap. He waited until her breathing was deep and even. Then he rose stiffly to his feet. He crossed the room and gently lifted her. This time, he laid her in his own cot, pulling the covers up to her chin. He looked down at her sleeping face, no longer contorted by fear, and saw the child she was supposed to be. He saw the ghost of his own daughter. The resemblance was not in the features, but in the innocence. An innocence that had been assaulted, but not, he prayed, extinguished. His gaze fell upon the oilskin satchel. It was lying on the floor where he dropped it the night before. He had forgotten about it. Now his curiosity mingled with a sense of dread. She had clung to it as if it were her own heart. He picked it up. It was light, but there was something solid inside. His fingers, clumsy with cold and emotion, fumbled with the stiff leather ties. He opened the flap and tipped the contents out onto his small wooden table. A single object fell out. A small leather-bound book. A ledger. It was worn, the cover scuffed, but it was well made. He opened it. The pages were filled with a neat, precise script. Columns of names, dates, and figures. It was a record of some kind. A meticulous accounting of goods, payments, debts. He scanned the pages, the names meaning nothing to him. Henderson, Blackwood, Miller. They were the names of local ranchers, merchants, homesteaders. Then he saw it, a name repeated again and again, at the top of almost every page, the recipient of the payments. A name that made the blood in his veins turn to slush. Silas Kane. The name was a ghost from his past, a specter he had fled 10 years ago. It was the name of the man who owned the valley, the mines, the lumber, the bank. He owned the sheriff and the judge. He owned the fear in every man's heart. He was a king on a throne built of corruption and violence. Elias had been the last town marshal with a spine straight enough to stand up to him. He had tried to gather evidence to build a case. He had gotten close, too close, and Kane had sent him a message. It wasn't a threat delivered to his face. It was a fire. A stray lamp, they called it. A fire in the general store while his wife, Mary, and his daughter, Sarah, were inside buying thread. The fire had been fast, the escape route blocked. It was meant to look like an accident. But Elias knew. He knew it was Cain's handiwork, a warning to the marshal who wouldn't bend. He had lost everything in one afternoon of smoke and ash. His family, his courage, his soul. He had turned in his badge, packed a single bag, and walked away. He had come up to this mountain to disappear, to let the man he used to be die. He had buried the marshal and become Elias, the hermit, a man hollowed out by grief, content to let the world rot without his interference. He sank onto the stool, the ledger heavy in his hands. He stared at the name, Silas Cain, and he understood. The girl, the bruises, the desperate flight into the storm. Her mother had sent her running with this book. This was the evidence he had failed to find. This was proof. And Cain's men were hunting for it, hunting for her. The hollow ache in his chest, the constant companion of his last decade, began to change. The cold, dead emptiness was filling with something else. It was hot. It was a molten, liquid rage. The grief was still there, a bedrock of sorrow, but this new feeling was growing over it, hardening it. It was the return of a purpose he thought had been burned to cinders with his family. He had run. He had failed Mary and Sarah. He had let their killer walk free, grow richer, more powerful. He had hidden from his duty, from his own heart. But the past had not stayed buried. It had sent a small, freezing child to his door with the truth in her hands. He looked from the ledger to the sleeping girl in his bed. He saw the bruises on her skin, the fear in her eyes. He saw the shadow of Cain looming over her, a darkness that would consume her as it had consumed everything else it touched. No, the word was not spoken. It was a vow forged in the new fire inside him. Not this time, not this child. He had failed his own daughter. He would not fail this one. He spent the rest of the day in a quiet, focused fury. He reinforced the door, hammering a heavy iron bar into place. He checked the seals on the window. He cleaned his hunting rifle, his movements economical and precise. He laid out his ammunition. He was no longer just a trapper. He was a soldier preparing a fortress. Lily woke in the late afternoon. She sat up in the cot, the blankets pulled around her waist, and watched him. The terror was gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet, solemn observation. She watched him check the action on the rifle, her gaze unwavering. "The man in the black coat," she said, her voice a small, clear bell in the quiet room. "He had a scar on his face, like a white snake." Elias froze. He knew the man she was talking about, Jedediah Stone, Cain's enforcer, a man who enjoyed his work. Elias had put him in a cell once. Stone had sworn he'd kill him for it. "He's the one who hurt Mama," Lily continued, her voice flat, stating a fact. "She gave me the book. She said, 'Run, Lily. Run to the mountains. Don't let them get the book.' Then he pushed her down, and I ran." Elias turned to face her. He saw the tears welling in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She was a soldier. She had followed her orders. "You did good, Lily," he said, his voice thick. "You did what your mama told you. You were brave." "I was scared," she whispered. "Being brave isn't about not being scared," he told her, the words coming from a place he thought long dead. "It's about being scared and doing what you have to do anyway, and that's what you did." She seemed to consider this. She looked around the small, sparse cabin, at the fire, at the rifle leaning against the wall, at him. Her gaze was unnervingly direct. That night, as he banked the fire and prepared to sleep on the bearskin rug, she spoke again from the cot. Her voice was small in the encroaching darkness. "Elias? I'm here." There was a long pause. He could hear the wind picking up again outside, whistling around the corners of the cabin. Are they going to find me?" she whispered. The question was heavy with a child's understanding of finality. She wasn't just asking about being found. She was asking about what came next. "Are they going to hurt me like they hurt Mama?" The question was a spear. It went straight through all his remaining defenses and pierced the very core of him. It was the question of every child who has ever looked to an adult for safety in a world that has proven to be monstrous. It was a question that demanded not just an answer, but a covenant. He rose from the floor and crossed the room in 2 long strides. He knelt beside the cot so his face was level with hers. In the dim, flickering firelight, he could see the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes. He reached out and for the first time touched her. He placed his large, rough hand gently on her shoulder. She did not flinch. "Listen to me, Lily," he said, and his voice was different now. It wasn't the gruff rasp of the hermit. It was the steady, iron-hard voice of the marshal he once was. It was the voice of a man making a promise he would die to keep. "They might come looking," he said, telling her the hard truth. "But they will not find you. And if they do find this cabin, they will have to come through me to get to you." He looked directly into her eyes, pouring every ounce of his conviction, his newfound purpose, into his gaze. "Nobody is going to hurt you, not while I'm here. I promise you." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "On my life, I promise." She held his gaze for a long moment, searching his face. He saw her small body relax, a tension she must have been holding for days finally letting go. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Then she lay back down, turned on her side, and closed her eyes. Within moments, she was asleep. Elias stayed kneeling by the cot for a long time, his hand still on her shoulder, as if he could physically impart his strength and will to her sleeping form. He was guarding her. It was a feeling both new and ancient, a sacred duty. Finally, he stood up. He walked over to the small shelf where he kept his meager supplies. Tucked in the back was a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey, his only companion on the longest, darkest nights. He took it down, holding it up to the firelight. He saw his own reflection in the glass, a gaunt, haunted man. He remembered all the nights he had spent trying to drown the ghosts in this bottle. But the ghosts were still there. Drowning didn't work. You had to face them. You had to fight them. He walked to the cabin door, unbarred it, and stepped out into the frigid night air. The wind cut at his face, but he barely felt it. He uncorked the bottle, turned it upside down, and poured the contents out into the snow. The dark liquid hissed in steam for a moment in the freezing air, then it was gone, swallowed by the white. He tossed the empty bottle deep into the woods. He went back inside, barring the door behind him. He walked to the old wooden chest at the foot of his cot. He hadn't opened it in 10 years. The hinges groaned in protest. Inside, beneath a folded wool blanket, lay his past, a worn leather gun belt and holster, and his old service revolver, a Colt Peacemaker. It was heavy, solid. The grip felt like a familiar handshake. It felt like coming home. He spent the next hour cleaning the revolver and the rifle with slow, methodical precision. The familiar sharp scent of gun oil filled the cabin, overriding the smells of wood smoke and stew. It was the smell of purpose, the smell of a reckoning. When he was finished, the weapons gleaming in the firelight, He did not put them away. He loaded the revolver and settled it into the holster on his hip. He leaned the rifle against the wall, right next to the door, where it would be ready. He did not go back to his makeshift bed on the floor. His time for sleeping was over. He pulled the three-legged stool to the window, sat down, and looked out. The storm had passed. A billion stars glittered in the cold, clear sky, throwing a pale, ethereal light on the snow-covered landscape. It was beautiful, and it was dangerous. They would be coming. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they would come. Cain would not suffer a loose end. Stone would not suffer a witness. Elias sat by the window, the heavy weight of the colt on his hip a comforting presence. He looked out at the vast, silent wilderness. He was no longer hiding in it. He was a part of it. He was a rock. He was a wall. He was the guardian on the edge of the world, waiting for the darkness to come. And this time, he would be ready.